The air at the grand entrance to the National Naval Aviation Museum was thick with a mixture of reverence and anticipation. It was the centennial anniversary of carrier aviation, a day for dress whites, polished brass, and the solemn remembrance of giants. A long, serpentine line of attendees, a blend of decorated officers, eager young cadets, and history-loving civilians, snaked across the sun-drenched plaza. Within this line, a figure stood apart, not by any deliberate action, but by his sheer, unassuming stillness. Arthur Vance was a man etched by time, his 80-some years carved into the deep lines of his face like a topographical map of a long and arduous journey. He wore a simple, slightly frayed tweed jacket over a plain-collared shirt, his posture softened by age but held with an unyielding, quiet dignity. He clutched nothing but a simple wooden cane, its rubber tip tapping a soft, patient rhythm on the polished granite. He had been in the line for nearly an hour, watching the world with eyes the color of a faded sky, eyes that had seen horizons most people could not even imagine. At the front of the line, a young security guard named Miller stood as a self-appointed Cerberus at the gates of history. His uniform was starched to an almost comical rigidity, his chest puffed out with the temporary authority vested in him. He wielded his metal detector wand and his clipped, officious tone like weapons. When Arthur finally reached the checkpoint, Miller's eyes, full of the bored arrogance of youth, swept over him with dismissive speed. "Invitation and ID," he barked, not as a request, but as a demand. Arthur calmly produced a worn leather wallet and a folded, official-looking invitation. He handed them over. Miller glanced at them, his lip curling into a subtle sneer. "Sir," he began, his voice dripping with condescension as he held up the veteran's identification card, "I'm having a hard time believing this is you. This card says you're a veteran. You don't look like much of a veteran to me." Arthur's voice, when it came, was a low, dry rasp, like stones tumbling in a slow river. "Time does that to a man," he said, his gaze unwavering. The comment, meant to be a simple statement of fact, seemed to enrage the young guard. It was as if Arthur's placid calm was a direct challenge to his authority. Miller pushed the ID back across the table. "Is this some kind of joke? I'm going to need to see it again. And I'm going to need you to state your purpose for attending this event. We've had issues with enthusiasts trying to sneak in." The injustice of the moment began to hang in the air, a palpable tension. Arthur Vance, who had asked for nothing, who had waited with the patience of a mountain, was being publicly questioned, his service implicitly labeled a lie. He simply picked up his ID, his hand steady, and prepared to present it again, his silence a shield against the boy's needless aggression. The young guard, Miller, was now fully committed to his theater of power. He saw not a man, but an opportunity. The old veteran's quiet dignity was, in his mind, a clear sign of weakness, a weakness he felt compelled to exploit. "Empty your pockets, sir. All of them. Place everything on the table. Slowly." His voice was louder now, a performance for the growing number of people in line who were starting to watch, their faces a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Arthur, with the same unhurried grace, did as he was told. He placed his worn leather wallet on the metal table. Next came a small, neatly folded handkerchief and a set of simple keys on a plain ring. There was a quiet finality to the gesture, as if that were all. But then, his hand went to his jacket's inner pocket and emerged with one last item. It was a small brass compass, no bigger than a silver dollar, its surface tarnished and dark with age. It made a soft, dull clink as he placed it on the table. Miller's eyes lit up with a kind of predatory glee. He had found his prop. He picked up the compass, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of trash. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered, his voice echoing slightly in the grand entryway. He held it up for the silent onlookers to see. "A prize from a cereal box, Grandpa? You think this little toy gets you some kind of special treatment?" He gave the compass a contemptuous little shake, the needle inside twitching erratically. "Let me guess, you think this makes you a real-life adventurer, an old sea dog?" He tapped his finger against the glass face, a sharp, percussive sound that seemed to cut through the hushed air. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Arthur's face. It wasn't anger. It was a deep, ancient pain, a shadow that momentarily clouded his faded blue eyes. The guard's mockery of the object was a desecration, a profanity spoken in a holy place. Miller, emboldened by the perceived reaction, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, insulting whisper. "Look, old man, I don't have time for games. Either you have a real reason to be here, or you can take your little trinkets and go wait for the museum to open to the general public. This event is for real heroes." That single, sharp tap on the glass of the compass was more than a physical act. It was a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for half a century. The sound, the touch, the glint of light off the scratched crystal face, it all conspired to tear a hole in the present. For Arthur Vance, the polished granite floor of the museum entrance dissolved into a sucking, viscous mud. The polite murmurs of the crowd were swallowed by the roar of monsoon rains and the deafening, percussive chatter of distant machine gun fire. The scent of saltwater and floor polish was replaced by the acrid, metallic smell of ozone, cordite, and blood. He was no longer an old man in a tweed jacket, he was 24 years old, his body a coiled spring of hardened muscle and honed survival instinct, wrapped in torn, jungle-stained fatigues. He was lying in the mud, the world a chaotic symphony of violence around him, and a heavy weight was pressing him down. It was his commanding officer, Captain Richards, a man who had been a titan just hours before, now made small by a single, well-placed piece of shrapnel. The captain's breath was coming in ragged, wet gasps. He pressed something small, round, and warm with his own life's heat into Arthur's palm, closing the young operative's fingers around it. It was the compass. "This will always point you home, Ghost Walker," the captain had whispered, his voice already a ghost. "The intel, it has to get out. They can't win. Finish the mission." The name Ghostwalker was a benediction and a curse, the secret call sign for a man tasked with moving through the world unseen. "Don't let them forget us," the captain had pleaded, his eyes losing focus. "Don't let them forget Task Force Nomad." Arthur had made a promise in that jungle hell, a silent vow over the body of his commander. The compass wasn't just a tool for navigation, it was the repository of that promise. It was the weight of every man in their secret unit who had never come home, a unit whose very existence was a classified secret, destined to be a footnote in a redacted file. The feel of Miller's arrogant finger tapping on the glass was a profound violation, a casual desecration of that sacred memory, and the immense weight of the 50-year-old promise settled back onto Arthur's shoulders, heavier than ever. A few yards away, overseeing the logistical flow of VIP arrivals, stood Commander Davies. He was a man in his late 40s, a career officer with the sharp, perceptive eyes of someone who understood that the most important battles were often the quietest ones. He had noticed the bottleneck at Guard Miller's checkpoint and had been observing the interaction for several minutes. At first, it was simple irritation. Miller was an overzealous private security contractor, a common enough problem at large events. But as he watched, a sense of deep unease began to settle in his gut. He saw the young guard's escalating arrogance, the way he puffed out his chest and raised his voice, a classic display of insecure authority. And he saw the old man's response, a preternatural calm, a stillness that was more powerful than any outburst. Commander Davies had served long enough to recognize that kind of quiet. It wasn't the quiet of weakness, it was the quiet of a man who had been to the edge of human experience and returned with nothing left to prove. It was the quiet of a true professional. He saw Miller snatch the small, glinting object from the table and mock it. He was too far away to see what it was, but he saw the old man's reaction, not a flinch of anger, but a deep, internal recoil, a flicker of immense pain that was almost instantly masked by that placid exterior. The commander's internal calculus shifted from irritation to alarm. An unwritten code was being violated here, a code of honor that transcended any security manual. He knew the protocols. Intervening directly would create a scene, undermine the security structure, and put him in a bureaucratic quagmire. He couldn't just stride over and dress down a civilian guard in front of hundreds of people. It wasn't his direct chain of command. But he also couldn't do nothing. His conscience, forged in the crucible of naval tradition, screamed at him that a grave injustice was unfolding. He made a decision. Turning his back to the scene as if taking a routine call, he pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket. He didn't dial the event security chief. He didn't dial the base commander. He scrolled to a number he rarely used, a number he had for only the most dire of circumstances, the direct line to Admiral Harrington's personal aide. The aide answered on the first ring, his voice crisp. "Yes, Commander?" Davies kept his own voice low and urgent. "Lieutenant, it's Davies. Patch me through to the Admiral. Now." There was a pause. "Sir, the Admiral is en route, he's dash." Davies cut him off. "It's an emergency. A broken arrow-level situation, you understand me?" The code was extreme, meant for catastrophic failures, but it got the point across. A moment later, a new voice, deep and commanding, came on the line. "Harrington. This had better be good, Davies." The commander took a breath. "Admiral, you need to get to the main entrance of the museum. Immediately. There's a security guard harassing an elderly veteran. Sir, his posture, his calm. I can't explain it, but I think it might be him. The one you told us stories about at the academy." A heavy silence fell on the other end of the line, a silence so profound it felt like the pressure in the atmosphere had dropped. Then, the Admiral's voice returned, no longer just commanding, but cold as the deep sea. "I'm 5 minutes out. Keep him there. Do not let that guard or that veteran leave. Under any circumstances." The line went dead. Commander Davies lowered his phone, his heart pounding. He had just thrown a 4-star admiral into a minor security dispute. He could only pray his instincts were right. The spectacle at the security gate had reached its ugly zenith. Guard Miller, holding the small brass compass aloft like a trophy, was delivering his final, condescending verdict. "I'm going to have to confiscate this, sir," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. "It could be a listening device, or, well, it's just not appropriate. You can file a claim to retrieve it later." He was about to drop the sacred object into a sterile plastic bin labeled confiscated items when a new sound sliced through the tense atmosphere. It was not the angry shout of a bystander or the quiet weeping of the humiliated old man. It was the piercing, unmistakable wail of sirens, distant at first, then growing in volume with astonishing speed, a sound that demanded attention and obedience. Heads turned. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals, became a single, unified body of confusion. 3 black, government-plated SUVs, flanked by 2 motorcycle outriders, screeched to a halt directly in front of the museum's main steps, their tires barking on the pavement. Their flashing red and blue lights painted the grand facade in strobing, urgent colors. The effect was immediate and absolute. All motion, all conversation, ceased. Before the vehicles had even fully settled on their suspension, the doors flew open with a practiced, terrifying synchronicity. From the rear vehicles, 8 United States Marines in full, immaculate dress blues emerged. They moved with a fluid, lethal precision, their white hats and gloves stark against the deep blue of their uniforms. They didn't run, they strode, forming 2 perfect, unwavering lines that created a formal corridor, a path of overwhelming authority that stretched from the door of the lead SUV directly to the source of the disturbance, Guard Miller's humble security table. The crowd, which had been pressing forward with morbid curiosity, now instinctively recoiled, parting like the Red Sea before this sudden, awe-inspiring display of military force. The air crackled with unspoken questions. This wasn't a response to a security dispute. This was the arrival of a king. The silence was so complete that the only sounds were the hum of the idling engines and the frantic, terrified thumping of Guard Miller's own heart. He stood frozen, the compass still held weakly in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He had wanted to be the center of attention. Now, he was at the epicenter of a hurricane, and he had no idea why. From the lead SUV, a single figure emerged. He was a tall man, his crisp, service dress white uniform adorned with the 4 gleaming stars of a full admiral. His name was Admiral Thomas Harrington, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and his face was carved from granite, his expression a thunderous mask of cold, controlled fury. He didn't glance at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the stunned museum officials who were now scurrying forward. His eyes, like chips of blue ice, were locked on a single point, the frail old man in the tweed jacket. The admiral strode through the corridor of Marines, his every step a hammer blow of purpose on the granite plaza. The honor guard stood as still as statues, their rifles held at a perfect present arms, a gesture of the highest respect. He walked directly past the security table, his gaze passing over Guard Miller as if the young man were nothing more than a piece of furniture, a transparent obstacle. He came to a halt no more than a foot in front of Arthur Vance. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The admiral, a pillar of modern military power, and the old man, a forgotten relic of a bygone war. Then, something extraordinary happened. The admiral's stony expression dissolved. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent awe. In the dead silence of the plaza, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, Admiral Thomas Harrington, a man who commanded fleets and advised presidents, brought his heels together with a sharp crack. He raised his right hand to his brow in the crispest, most heartfelt salute he had ever rendered in his 40-year career. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer a commander's bark, but a booming, emotional tribute that echoed across the plaza, each word laden with the weight of history. "Ghostwalker," he said, the secret call sign hanging in the air like a sacred verse. The name meant nothing to the crowd, but to the man before him, it was everything. "Sir," the admiral continued, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide, "it is an honor to stand in your presence again." The crowd gasped as one. Guard Miller's jaw dropped, his face turning a ghastly shade of white. He was no longer just a security guard who had made a mistake. He was a man who had committed sacrilege. Admiral Harrington held his salute for a long, respectful moment before slowly lowering his hand. His attention, however, remained entirely on Arthur Vance. Then, with a gentleness that was utterly at odds with his imposing presence, he turned his gaze to the frozen hand of Guard Miller. The young man was still clutching the tarnished brass compass, his fingers locked around it in a state of paralytic shock. The admiral did not snatch it. He simply extended his own hand, palm up, a silent, unanswerable command. Miller's fingers released the object as if it had suddenly become white-hot, and the compass fell into the admiral's waiting palm. Harrington closed his hand around it, not as if he were holding a piece of evidence, but as if he were receiving a holy sacrament. He then turned, not to the guard, not even to Arthur, but to the silent, captive audience. He held the small compass aloft, its tarnished brass catching the sunlight. "This," the admiral began, his voice a resonant baritone that carried to the furthest edges of the plaza, "is not a toy. It is not a trinket." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. For 50 years, the United States Navy has held a secret. A story of a unit so clandestine, so effective, that its very existence had to be stricken from the official records to protect its methods and its men. They were called Task Force Nomad. A murmur went through the officers in the crowd. The name was a whisper, a legend, a ghost story told in the halls of Annapolis and Coronado. Most thought it was a myth. This man, the admiral declared, turning his eyes back to Arthur Vance with immeasurable respect, was their lead operative. Their point man. The one they sent into the dark when all other options had failed. His call sign was Ghostwalker. He began to recite Arthur's history as if reading from a sacred text, his voice painting vivid pictures of impossible heroism. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, Ghostwalker, operating alone for 96 hours behind enemy lines, neutralized a command and control bunker that was directing attacks on the USS Enterprise. His actions saved that carrier and the 3,000 souls aboard her. The official report attributes the bunker's destruction to an unexplained ordnance detonation. That was this man. The crowd was spellbound. In 1971, he led a two-man team on a high-altitude, low-opening jump into a fortified POW camp. They were to be the Judas Goats, drawing fire so a larger rescue force could pinpoint enemy positions. The rescue was a success. He was the only one who made it back, carrying his wounded partner for 3 days through the jungle. For this, he was awarded a Navy Cross in a ceremony so secret, only the President and the Secretary of the Navy were present. Finally, the Admiral held the compass up again. This compass is the unit marker of Task Force Nomad, given only to its founding members. This specific one was pressed into his hand by his dying commanding officer on a night when this man, Arthur Vance, held a narrow pass against an entire enemy battalion, armed with little more than his rifle, his courage, and his promise to get the intelligence out. He is the last surviving member of that unit. He does not just carry their memory. He is their memory. He is a living monument to a sacrifice our nation was never allowed to properly acknowledge. With the story told and the hero's honor restored, a terrifying change came over Admiral Harrington. The warmth and reverence in his face vanished, extinguished as if a switch had been flipped. The temperature around him seemed to drop by 20 degrees. He turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion, and his eyes, now arctic cold and devoid of all emotion, fell upon the trembling form of Guard Miller. The full, crushing weight of his 4-star rank, of the entire United States Navy, descended upon the young man's shoulders. The Admiral's voice, when it came, was no longer a booming tribute. It was a low, chilling whisper, a sound far more devastating than any shout. It was the sound of a career and a life being surgically dismantled. "You," the Admiral hissed, the single word dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. "You asked this man for his identification." He took a step closer, invading Miller's personal space. This man's face is his identification in every naval installation on this planet. His presence on this hallowed ground is an honor this institution has not earned, and you treated him like a trespasser. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet, controlled fury was infinitely more terrifying. You questioned his service. You, in your starched, store-bought uniform that you've likely never sweat in, questioned the honor of a man who bled for this country in places your worst nightmares can't even conjure. You mocked his most sacred possession. You called him Grandpa. With each sentence, Miller seemed to shrink, to crumble in on himself under the unbearable weight of the Admiral's words. You are a textbook example of everything wrong with vesting authority in those who have not earned it through sacrifice. You are arrogant. You are blind. And you are a disgrace to the uniform you wear, even if it is just a security costume. You have failed in your duty to protect this place, because you have no comprehension of what it is you are protecting. The Admiral paused, letting the silence amplify the guard's public humiliation. Then came the sentence. You are relieved of duty. Effective immediately. Your supervisor, he said, flicking his eyes for a microsecond to a pale-faced man who was already stepping forward, will escort you to the base stockade, where you will be held pending my arrival. Your security clearance is revoked. Your employment is terminated. I will personally see to it that your name is blacklisted from every federal, state, and private security contract in this nation. Your lesson in respect is about to begin. And it will be long, and it will be arduous. The verdict was absolute. Final. Miller's world had just ended. The young man stood on the brink of total ruin. His face was a ghastly white, his bravado shattered into a million pieces. Tears of shame and terror streamed down his cheeks, and a choked, pitiful sob escaped his lips. The supervisor, his own face a mask of fear, stepped forward and placed a hand on Miller's arm to lead him away to his doom. The crowd watched in stunned, pitiless silence. The justice was harsh, but it felt righteous. It was in that moment of absolute condemnation that a different voice cut through the tension. It was quiet, raspy, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank or uniform. "Admiral." All heads, including the admiral's, snapped toward Arthur Vance. The old man had taken a single, slow step forward. He looked not at the admiral, but at the broken, weeping young man. The expression in his faded blue eyes was not one of triumph or vindication. It was one of profound, heartbreaking sadness. There was a flicker of empathy, of a deep understanding of human frailty. "Let the boy be," Arthur said, his words simple, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. The admiral stared at him, bewildered. "Sir, he dishonored you." Arthur gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "He is young," he said, his voice soft but clear. The uniform, it made him feel tall. It made him feel important. He forgot what it stands for. He paused, his gaze meeting Miller's. "We all forget sometimes. We all have moments where our pride gets the better of our character." He then turned his gaze to the admiral, and for the first time, he reached out, placing his gnarled, steady hand on the admiral's starched white sleeve. It was a gesture of immense intimacy and power. "Let this be his lesson, Tom," Arthur said, using the admiral's first name, a familiarity that spoke of a bond deeper than rank. "Let this moment, this shame, be his teacher. Don't let it be the end of his service." A man can learn more from one moment of grace than from 1,000 days of punishment. The magnanimity of the act was stunning. The hero, in his moment of ultimate vindication, chose not vengeance, but mercy. He chose to build up the very man who had tried to tear him down. For Miller, this unexpected act of grace was a far more powerful rebuke than the admiral's fury. It was a lesson in true strength, delivered not with a sword, but with an open hand. The plaza remained silent, but the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of awe. The admiral stood for a long moment, looking from the ancient, forgiving eyes of the hero to the tear-streaked face of the disgraced guard. A complex series of emotions played across the senior officer's face: surprise, confusion, and finally, a dawning, profound understanding. He had come here to dispense justice, but he was being given a lesson in grace. He finally gave a slow, respectful nod. He turned back to the trembling supervisor and the still sobbing Miller. "As you were," he commanded, his voice softer now, but no less firm. The order for imprisonment was rescinded. He then looked directly at Miller, his gaze still hard, but no longer filled with pure contempt. "You heard him. You have been given a reprieve by a man you are not worthy of shining the shoes of. You will not be terminated." A flicker of hope appeared in Miller's eyes, but the admiral quickly crushed any sense of relief. "Instead, you will be reassigned. You will be the first and only participant in a new mandatory training program. You will spend the next 6 months studying the complete, unredacted histories of every Medal of Honor recipient in naval history. You will write a personal report on each one. And you will spend your weekends volunteering at the VA hospital, cleaning floors and listening to the stories of the men you have, until now, been blind to. This is your lesson. Do you understand?" Miller could only nod, his sobs of terror replaced by gasps of overwhelming, undeserved relief. In the weeks that followed, a new directive was quietly circulated through all naval security commands. It was a training module focused on veteran interaction, historical awareness, and the core tenets of respect. It was officially designated Special Protocol 734, but among those who knew the story, it was simply called the Vance Protocol. Months passed. The world moved on. In the quiet, sterile cafeteria of a local VA hospital, Arthur Vance sat alone at a small table, patiently stirring a spoonful of sugar into a cup of steaming tea. He was a man at peace, a ghost happily haunting the quiet corners of the world. A figure approached his table, hesitant, almost shy. It was a young man in simple civilian clothes, his posture no longer puffed up with false pride, but slightly stooped with humility. It was the former guard Miller. He held a cup of black coffee in his hands. He stood by the table for a moment, unsure of what to say. Arthur looked up, his eyes showing a flicker of recognition but no animosity. Miller cleared his throat. I brought you this," he said, placing the coffee on the table. "I've been reading, sir," he continued, his voice quiet and earnest. "About Task Force Nomad. The declassified portions, anyway. What you did, what all of you did." He trailed off, unable to find the words. He finally just said, "Thank you." Arthur Vance simply nodded, a small, kind smile touching the corners of his lips. He didn't speak of forgiveness, it was unnecessary. The young man's presence, his changed demeanor, was absolution enough. With a simple gesture of his hand, Arthur indicated the empty chair across from him. Miller, after a moment's hesitation, sat down. In the quiet hum of the cafeteria, an old warrior and a young man learning the first true meaning of honor sat in a comfortable, healing silence. Stories like Arthur Vance's are not just tales of the past, they are living lessons in humility, courage, and the quiet dignity that defines a true hero. They remind us that behind every aged face, there may be a history of sacrifice we can scarcely imagine. The greatest honors are often unseen, and the deepest respect is paid not in grand ceremonies, but in small, quiet moments of understanding. If you were moved by the story of Ghostwalker and his incredible act of grace, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to Veteran Valor. Let's work together to ensure that the legends of these incredible men and women are never forgotten. Their legacy is our shared heritage, and it is our duty to honor it.